They mocked my senior dating profile until they met my senior executive boyfriend at 62 years old. I never thought I'd be sitting in a trendy coffee shop downtown, frantically deleting comments from my phone while tears threatened to spill over my reading glasses. The barista, a young woman with purple hair and kind eyes, had just asked if I was okay when she noticed my hands shaking as I gripped my latte. I wanted to tell her that 3 hours ago, I thought I was brave. I thought I was finally ready to put myself out there again after being widowed for 4 years. I thought creating an online dating profile at my age was an act of courage, not an invitation for public humiliation. But there I was, watching notification after notification pop up on my phone, each one cutting deeper than the last. "Desperate granny alert," read one comment. "Someone's grandmother escaped the nursing home," said another. The worst part wasn't even the strangers mocking my profile picture or questioning why a woman my age would dare to seek companionship. The worst part was seeing my own daughter Claire's name among the commenters, writing, "Oh my God, Mom, this is so embarrassing. Please take this down before anyone else sees it. My name is May Thompson," and until that moment, I had convinced myself that starting over at 62 was not only possible but empowering. I had worked my entire career as a corporate communications director, raised 2 successful children as a single mother after my husband David passed away from cancer, and spent the last 4 years learning to live alone in a house that felt too big and too quiet. Friends had been encouraging me to date again, to find companionship, to stop spending Friday nights reorganizing my book collection, or watching old movies with a glass of wine and my cat, Fitzgerald. So I had taken their advice. I hired a professional photographer, bought a new dress the color of sapphires that made my silver hair look elegant rather than old, and crafted what I thought was a thoughtful, honest profile on a dating app designed for mature adults. I wrote about my love for classical music and weekend farmers markets, my pride in my children's accomplishments, and my hope to find someone who valued conversation over texting, quality time over casual encounter. I mentioned that I was financially independent, owned my home outright, and was looking for genuine connection with someone who understood that life's second chapters could be just as meaningful as the first. What I hadn't anticipated was my daughter screenshotting my profile and sharing it in her neighborhood mom's group chat as a joke. What I hadn't expected was for that screenshot to make its way to social media, where it became the target of ridicule from people who seemed to find the very idea of a woman my age seeking love to be hilarious. Comments poured in about how I should act my age, how I was trying too hard, and how I should focus on being a grandmother instead of chasing men like a teenager. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning it all started, I woke up in my bedroom, overlooking the garden I had spent decades cultivating. The October light, filtered through lace curtains, that David and I had hung together 25 years ago, casting gentle shadows across the hardwood floors. At 62, I had learned to appreciate these quiet morning moments, the way the house settled around me like a familiar embrace, the sound of Fitzgerald purring from his spot on the windowsill where he watched birds flutter among the maple trees that were just beginning to turn gold. I had been retired for 2 years now after spending 37 years climbing the corporate ladder at Meridian Communications, a mid-sized firm where I had started as a secretary and worked my way up to senior director of corporate relations. The transition to retirement had been harder than I expected. Not financially, thankfully. My investments and pension provided more than enough for my modest needs, but emotionally. For nearly 4 decades, I had been May Thompson, the woman who could manage crisis communications during company mergers, who could craft press releases that turned potentially damaging news into opportunities, who could command a boardroom full of executives and make them listen. Now I was just May Thompson, David's widow Claire and Marcus's mother, and increasingly it felt like I was becoming invisible to the world around me. My children, both successful in their own right, called dutifully but briefly. Claire, 34, worked as a pediatric nurse in Seattle, and was constantly busy with her own 2 young children and her husband Brad's demanding schedule as a software engineer. Marcus, 31, lived in Chicago where he worked in finance, and though we texted regularly, our conversations rarely went deeper than updates about work and weather. I had filled my days with activities that felt meaningful but solitary. I volunteered at the local library twice a week, reading to children during story hour, and helping seniors navigate the computer lab. I maintained my garden with the devotion of someone who understood that nurturing beautiful things was its own form of prayer. I attended book club meetings at the community center, where discussions about literature often turned into conversations about grandchildren, health concerns, and the various ways we were all learning to navigate this stage of life that society seemed eager to rush us through or ignore entirely. But in the quiet moments, especially in the evenings when the house felt particularly empty, I found myself wondering if this was all there was left. I had loved David deeply, and his loss had carved a hollow space in my chest that I thought might never heal. We had met in college, married young, and built a life together that was comfortable and predictable. He was a steady man, a high school history teacher who came home every evening at the same time, who read the newspaper with his morning coffee, and who showed his love through small, consistent gestures rather than grand romantic display. After he died, I had thrown myself into work, into raising my children, into proving that I could handle everything alone, and I had handled it, successfully, competently, but somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that being capable of solitude didn't mean I had to choose it forever. It was my friend Sarah, a widow herself who had remarried 3 years after her husband's death, who first suggested I consider dating again. "May," she had said over lunch at our favorite bistro downtown, "you're 62, not 92. You're healthy, you're beautiful, you're intelligent, and you have so much love to give. David wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your life alone." We had been discussing her recent trip to Europe with her new husband, Robert, and I had felt a pang of something that might have been envy watching her face light up, as she described walking through Parisian gardens hand in hand with someone who clearly adored her. The idea had seemed both thrilling and terrifying. I hadn't been on a date since I was 22 years old. I didn't know the rules anymore, didn't understand how people met and connected in an age of smartphones and social media. But Sarah had been patient, explaining how online dating worked for people our age, how there were platforms specifically designed for mature adults, seeking genuine relationships rather than casual encounters. "It's not about replacing David," she had assured me. "It's about honoring the fact that you're still here, still living, still capable of growing and changing and experiencing new things." Her words had stayed with me for weeks, echoing through my evening walks and my solitary dinners, until finally I decided she was right. I spent 2 weeks crafting my profile, writing and rewriting the description of who I was and what I was looking for. I wanted to be honest about my age, my stage in life, my desire for companionship over adventure. I chose photos that showed me as I really was, a woman in her 60s who took care of herself but wasn't trying to pretend she was 40. I wore minimal makeup in the main photo, letting my silver hair catch the light, smiling genuinely because the photographer, a lovely woman named Janet, who specialized in portraits for mature clients, had made me laugh just as she clicked the shutter. In my written profile, I was straightforward about what I had to offer and what I hoped to find. I described myself as a recently retired communications professional who valued honesty, intellectual conversation, and shared experience. I mentioned my love for cooking, though I admitted I rarely bothered with elaborate meals for one. I wrote about my garden, my volunteer work, my adult children who lived in other cities. I was clear that I wasn't looking for someone to take care of me financially or emotionally, but rather someone to share life's remaining adventures with, whether that meant traveling to places we'd never seen, or simply reading the Sunday paper together over coffee. I mentioned that I owned my home, a modest but well-maintained colonial in the Riverside neighborhood that David and I had bought when Claire was 3 and Marcus was an infant. I talked about my cat, Fitzgerald, named after the author rather than the president, and warned potential matches that he was particular about strangers, but eventually warmed up to people who respected his boundary. I tried to convey that I was someone who had lived fully, experienced loss, and was still interested in what came next. When I finally published the profile, I felt a mixture of pride and terror. Here I was, putting myself out there in a way I hadn't done in over 40 years, admitting to the world that I was lonely, that I wanted more than the peaceful but solitary life I had built for myself. I told myself that even if nothing came of it, Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. At least I had honored the part of myself that still believed in possibility. For the first day, nothing happened. I checked the app obsessively, refreshing my messages and viewing statistics like a teenager waiting for text responses. Then, slowly, notifications began arriving. A few messages from men whose profiles seemed sincere, whose photos showed them engaged in activities they clearly enjoyed, whose opening messages referenced specific things they had noticed in my profile rather than generic compliments about my appearance. I felt hopeful, cautiously optimistic that this experiment in putting myself back out there might actually lead somewhere meaningful. I had even started responding to a message from a man named Richard who lived in the neighboring town and shared my love of classical music and hiking, when my phone buzzed with a notification that changed everything. It was a text from my daughter Claire. "Mom, please tell me you didn't actually create a dating profile." Attached was a screenshot of my profile but not as it appeared on the dating app. Instead, it was posted in what appeared to be a Facebook group with dozens of laughing emoji reactions and comments that made my stomach drop. "Local granny thinks she's hot stuff," read the caption that someone had added to my photo. "Who wants to tell her that ship sailed decades ago?" I stared at the screen in disbelief, scrolling through comment after comment that treated my sincere attempt at finding companionship as entertainment. Women young enough to be my daughters were commenting about how desperate I seemed, how I should focus on being a grandmother instead of trying to relive my youth. Men made crude jokes about what I might be looking for, reducing my carefully crafted profile to a series of assumptions about older women and sexuality that made me feel sick. But what hurt most was seeing the name I recognized among the comment. Claire had written, "OMG, this is so embarrassing. Please take this down before anyone else sees it." Not only had she failed to defend me, or ask people to stop mocking her mother, but she had actively participated in my humiliation, prioritizing her own embarrassment over my dignity. I called her immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed her number. She answered on the third ring, her voice tight with annoyance. "Mom, I really hope you're calling to tell me you've deleted that profile." There was no warmth in her greeting, no acknowledgement that she had just watched strangers ridicule her mother online without saying a word in my defense. "Claire, how did my profile end up in a Facebook group?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I shared it privately on the dating app. How did it become public?" There was a pause, and I could hear children laughing in the background, the normal sounds of her busy household continuing while my world felt like it was collapsing. "I may have shown it to a few friends," she said finally. "I was worried about you, Mom. I thought maybe if other people saw how this looked, you'd realize it wasn't a good idea." "You thought the best way to help me was to humiliate me publicly?" I asked, sinking into my kitchen chair as the full impact of her betrayal hit me. "You took something private and personal and turned it into a joke for strangers to laugh at." "I didn't mean for it to go viral," she said defensively. "I just showed it to my mom's group because I wanted advice on how to talk to you about this. Someone must have shared it from there." "But honestly, Mom, can you blame people for being surprised? You're 62 years old. Aren't you past all this dating drama? Past all this dating drama?" As if wanting companionship, wanting to share my life with someone, was some kind of juvenile phase I should have outgrown along with acne and poor decision-making. As if reaching 62 had somehow made me less deserving of love, less worthy of partnership, less human in my need for connection. "I'm past wanting to be happy?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm past deserving companionship. I'm past being allowed to hope for more than spending the rest of my life alone." "That's not what I meant," Claire said, but her tone suggested that maybe it was exactly what she meant. "It's just that you're at a different stage of life now. You have us, you have your grandchildren when you visit. Why do you need some random man complicating things?" I thought about explaining to her that loving her and her children didn't fill every corner of my heart, that being a mother and grandmother were beautiful parts of my identity but not the sum total of who I was. I thought about telling her that I still woke up sometimes reaching for David's warm presence beside me, still set the table for two out of habit, still found myself saving up funny stories to tell someone who was no longer there to hear them. But looking at the comments still streaming in on her phone screen, reading the casual cruelty of people who saw my desire for love as something laughable, I realized that explaining wouldn't matter. To them, to Claire, to apparently most of the world, a woman my age seeking romance was inherently ridiculous. I had become invisible in the way that older women do, not just overlooked, but actively dismissed when I dared to assert that I still had desires, still had dreams, still had something to offer. "I have to go," I told Claire, ending the call before she could respond. I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived, the family photos and handmade pottery and recipe books, filled with dishes I had perfected over decades of feeding people I love. But in that moment, none of it felt like enough to counteract the message I was receiving loud and clear. My time for love was over. My time for putting myself first, for hoping for more, for believing I deserved partnership and passion and the simple joy of sharing daily life with someone who chose to be there, was done. I deleted my dating profile that afternoon, watching my carefully chosen photos and thoughtfully written words disappear with a few taps of my finger. Then I turned off my phone and spent the rest of the day in my garden pulling weeds with more force than necessary, trying to channel my hurt and anger into something productive. Fitzgerald followed me outside, weaving between the flower beds and occasionally brushing against my legs as if he sensed my distress. That night, I sat alone at my dining room table with a bowl of soup and a glass of wine, just as I had every night for the past 4 years. But this time, instead of feeling peaceful in my solitude, I felt defeated. The silence that had once seemed comfortable now felt like a sentence I would serve for the rest of my life. I had tried to be brave, tried to reach for something more, and been told in the most public and humiliating way possible that women like me should be grateful for what we have, and stop asking for more. I went to bed that night, believing that my romantic life was truly over, that at 62 I had aged out of the possibility of finding love again. I thought the mockery and humiliation I had experienced was the universe's way of telling me to accept my place as a widow, a mother, a grandmother, but never again as a woman deserving of passion and partnership. I had no idea that in just 3 weeks everything would change in a way that would make every person who had laughed at my profile wish they could take back every cruel word they had written. The weeks that followed felt like living underwater. Everything seemed muffled and distant, as if I was moving through my daily routines from behind thick glass that separated me from the rest of the world. I continued my volunteer work at the library, smiled at the children during story time, and helped Miss Chan navigate the computer system to video call her grandson in California, but I felt like I was performing the role of Mae Thompson rather than actually being her. The online humiliation had done more than just embarrass me, it had fundamentally shifted how I saw myself in the world. For 4 years after David's death, I had slowly built up my confidence as a single woman, learned to make decisions without consulting anyone, discovered that I could manage home repairs and financial planning and holiday traditions on my own. I had felt competent, even empowered in my independence, but the mockery had stripped away that hard-won self-assurance, leaving me questioning not just my judgment about dating, but my right to want anything beyond the narrow expectations of what a 62-year-old widow should desire. I stopped going to book club meetings, claiming I had caught a cold that lingered for weeks. I avoided the farmers market downtown where I had been a regular for years, worried that someone might recognize me from the viral screenshot and whisper to their companions about the desperate grandmother who thought she could find love online. Even grocery shopping became an exercise in hypervigilance, scanning faces to see if anyone looked at me with recognition or amusement. My friend Sarah called repeatedly, but I let her messages go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to hear her reassurances or her suggestions that I try again with a different approach. The wound was too fresh, the humiliation too complete. She had been the one to encourage me to put myself out there, and while I didn't blame her for what happened, I also couldn't bear to relive the experience by discussing it with someone who had found love again so easily. Claire called too, but those conversations were stilted and awkward. She seemed to expect me to thank her for saving me from making a bigger mistake, as if the public humiliation had been a necessary intervention rather than a betrayal. She would update me on the children's activities, Brad's latest work project, the renovations they were planning for their kitchen, but there was a careful distance in her voice, as if she was monitoring herself to avoid saying anything that might lead back to the topic we both knew was hanging between us. "I hope you understand I was just looking out for you," she said during one particularly tense call. "I know it seemed harsh, but Mom, you have to admit it was a little naive to think that dating at your age would be the same as it was when you were young, dating at your age." The phrase echoed in my head long after we hung up. When had my age become a disqualifier for basic human experiences? When had reaching 62 made me too old for companionship, too past my expiration date for romance? I had friends who had remarried in their 70s, who had found love in assisted living facilities, who had met partners at senior centers and community college classes, but somehow my desire to find someone through modern methods had been deemed laughable. I began avoiding mirrors, hurrying past the bathroom reflection that used to please me with its evidence of a woman aging gracefully. Now all I could see were the lines around my eyes, the silver in my hair, the softness around my jawline that marked me as someone society had apparently decided should be grateful for invisibility rather than hoping for visibility. The sapphire dress I had worn for my profile photos hung in my closet like evidence of my foolishness, and I found myself gravitating toward the darkest, most shapeless clothes I owned, as if making myself smaller might protect me from further judgment. Marcus called from Chicago one evening in early November, his voice carrying the careful tone he used when he was trying to navigate family drama without taking sides. "Mom, Claire mentioned you've been going through a rough patch. Is everything okay?" I appreciated that he hadn't immediately launched into the same lecture about age-appropriate behavior that his sister seemed determined to deliver. Marcus had always been more diplomatic, more inclined to listen before offering opinion. But I also knew that admitting the depth of my humiliation to my son would only confirm what everyone seemed to believe, that I had made a fool of myself by thinking I could start over romantically at this stage of life. "I'm fine," I said, the automatic response I had perfected over weeks of well-meaning inquiries from neighbors and acquaintances who had heard various versions of what happened, "just adjusting to some changes." Claire said, "You tried online dating," he said gently. "That took courage, Mom. I'm sorry it didn't work out the way you hoped." His kindness caught me off guard, and I felt tears threatening for the first time in days. "It was a mistake," I said quickly. "I should have known better." "Should have known better than to want companionship?" he asked. "Mom, you're not ancient. You're not asking for anything unreasonable, and honestly, anyone who would mock someone for putting themselves out there is probably not worth knowing anyway." I wanted to explain to him that it wasn't just anonymous strangers who had mocked me, but his own sister who had facilitated my public humiliation. I wanted to tell him that the comments hadn't just stung, they had fundamentally altered how I saw myself and my place in the world. But Marcus lived 2,000 miles away, was building his own career and his own life, and I didn't want to burden him with the complicated dynamics of what had happened between Claire and me. Instead, I deflected, asking about his work and listening to him describe a recent promotion that would require more travel but came with a significant salary increase. He was building the kind of life David and I had dreamed our children would have, successful and independent and full of possibilities. I tried to focus on my pride in his accomplishments rather than the growing sense that my own possibilities had somehow been foreclosed. After we hung up, I sat in my living room with Fitzgerald curled in my lap, stroking his fur and trying to understand how I had gone from feeling hopeful and brave to feeling ashamed and defeated in such a short time. The house around me was beautiful, filled with furniture David and I had chosen together, walls lined with books we had collected over decades, photographs documenting a life well lived and children successfully raised. By any objective measure, I had reasons to feel proud and content. But contentment and happiness weren't the same thing, and I was beginning to realize that I had been confusing the two for years. I had been content with my quiet routines, my predictable days, my peaceful solitude, but I hadn't been happy. Not really. Not the way I had been when I was sharing my life with someone who knew my thoughts before I spoke them, who brought me coffee exactly the way I liked it without being asked, who made ordinary Tuesday evenings feel special simply by being present. The dating profile had been my first real attempt to reach for happiness rather than settling for contentment,
and the response had been so swift and so brutal that I wondered if I would ever be brave enough to reach for anything again. It felt safer to retreat back into the role of the dignified widow, the devoted mother, the reliable volunteer who showed up where she was needed, but never asked for anything in return. But safety, I was learning, was just another word for slow suffocation. The library where I volunteered had become my refuge, the one place where I felt useful without feeling exposed. The children didn't care about my age or my romantic disappointments. They just wanted to hear stories and sometimes fell asleep against my shoulder during the quieter picture book. The seniors who came for computer help appreciated my patience and didn't judge me for anything beyond my ability to help them navigate Medicare websites and email systems. It was there on a gray Thursday afternoon in late November that I met Eleanor Rodriguez. She was probably in her mid-70s, impeccably dressed in a wool coat the color of burgundy wine, with silver hair styled in an elegant bob and eyes that missed nothing. She had been struggling with the library's new catalog system, muttering under her breath in both English and Spanish about technology designed by people who clearly didn't understand how normal humans thought. "May I help you?" I offered, sliding into the chair beside her at the computer terminal. She looked at me with the assessing gaze of someone who had learned to be selective about accepting help. "I'm trying to find books about widowhood that aren't written by 25-year-old therapists who think grief has a timeline," she said with a wry smile. "Do you think such things exist?" I laughed despite myself, the first genuine laugh I had produced in weeks. "I think we might be looking for the same books," I said, pulling up the search function. "Let me see what we can find." We spent the next hour discovering that the library's collection of books about later life transitions was disappointingly thin, but our conversation was rich with the kind of understanding that only comes from shared experience. Eleanor had been widowed for 6 years after 43 years of marriage to a man she described as the love of my life and the bane of my existence, sometimes on the same day. "The hardest part," she said as we walked toward the parking lot together, "isn't missing him, though I do every day. It's the way everyone else expects you to be grateful for what you had and stop wanting anything new, as if loving someone deeply means you're not allowed to love again." Her words hit me like a physical blow, so precisely did they capture what I had been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate. "Everyone keeps telling me I should focus on my grandchildren," I said, "as if being a grandmother is supposed to be fulfilling enough for the rest of my life." Eleanor stopped walking and turned to face me fully. "How old are you, dear?" 62, I said, prepared for the inevitable comment about how young that was, how much life I had left ahead of me, all the platitudes I had been hearing for months. Instead, she nodded thoughtfully. "I was 68 when I met Robert," she said. "My children were horrified. They acted like I was betraying their father's memory by even considering dating again. But you know what I learned? Their comfort with my choices wasn't more important than my right to make them." Robert.
She had met someone, at 68. And not only met someone, but apparently built something meaningful enough that she spoke of him with the casual possessiveness of an established relationship. "Are you still together?" I asked, hardly daring to hope for the answer I wanted to hear. "We're getting married in the spring," she said with a smile that transformed her entire face. It took me 2 years to stop feeling guilty about being happy again. But I finally realized that honoring my late husband's memory didn't require me to live the rest of my life alone. We exchanged phone numbers before parting, and Eleanor made me promise to call her soon. "I have a feeling we have more to talk about," she said. "And May, if you don't mind some advice from someone who's been where you are, don't let other people's discomfort with your choices convince you to make smaller ones. The world will try to shrink you down to what feels manageable to them. Don't let them." I drove home in a daze, her words replaying in my mind like a song I couldn't stop humming. For the first time since the online humiliation, I felt a tiny spark of something that might have been hope. Not hope for any specific outcome, but hope that maybe my story wasn't over, that maybe the chapter I had been trying to write wasn't as impossible as everyone seemed to think. That evening, I called Sarah for the first time in over a month. She picked up on the first ring, her voice warm with relief and barely contained questions. "May, thank God. I've been so worried about you. How are you holding up?" I told her about meeting Eleanor, about the conversation that had shifted something fundamental in my perspective. Sarah listened without interrupting, and I could hear her moving around her kitchen, probably preparing dinner for Robert while she gave me her full attention. "She's right. You know," Sarah said when I finished, "I should have said something stronger when you told me what happened with Claire and those awful people online. I was so focused on not wanting to interfere in your family relationships that I didn't stand up for you the way I should have." "It's not your job to fight my battles," I said, though I appreciated the acknowledgement more than I could express. "Maybe not. But it is my job as your friend to remind you who you are when the world tries to convince you you're someone smaller," she said. "May, you are one of the most vibrant, intelligent, beautiful women I know. The fact that some cruel people decided to mock you says everything about them, and nothing about you." We talked for over an hour, and by the time we hung up, I felt more like myself than I had in weeks. Not completely healed, not ready to jump back into dating or put myself out there again, but no longer convinced that wanting more than solitude made me foolish or pathetic. I spent the next few days thinking about what Eleanor had said about not letting the world shrink me down to what felt manageable to them. I realized that in the weeks since my online humiliation, I had been doing exactly that, making myself smaller and quieter and less visible, hoping that if I took up less space, I would be less likely to be hurt again. But smaller hadn't made me safer. It had just made me sadder. I began venturing out more, returning to the farmer's market where I had been a regular for years, holding my head high and making eye contact with vendors who greeted me warmly, clearly unaware of my recent mortification. I signed up for a watercolor class at the community college, something I had been considering for months, but had talked myself out of as frivolous. Most importantly, I started responding to Claire's calls with more honesty about how her actions had affected. When she called to update me on her children's upcoming holiday concert, I listened politely and then said, "Claire, I need you to know that what happened with my dating profile isn't something I'm ready to pretend. Didn't matter." There was a long pause. "Mom, I thought we had moved past that." "You may have moved past it, but I haven't," I said. "I need you to understand that sharing something private and personal about me without my permission, and then participating in public mockery of your own mother damaged our relationship in ways I'm still trying to process." "I didn't participate in mockery," she said defensively. "I was embarrassed." "There's a difference. You posted a comment saying it was embarrassing and asking people to take it down," I said. "You didn't defend me or ask people to stop being cruel. You prioritized your own discomfort over my dignity." Another long pause. "I didn't think about it that way." "I know you didn't," I said, "and that's part of what hurts. It didn't occur to you that I might need my daughter to stand up for me instead of being ashamed of." We didn't resolve everything in that conversation, or in the several difficult discussions that followed over the next few weeks, but Claire seemed genuinely surprised by the depth of my hurt, and gradually began to understand that her reaction had been about more than just embarrassment. It had been about a fundamental failure to see me as a whole person rather than just as her mother. Meanwhile, my friendship with Eleanor deepened. We met for coffee twice a week, sometimes at the library cafe, sometimes at a small bistro downtown that served excellent scones and didn't mind if we lingered for hours. She told me stories about Robert, whom she had met at a grief support group, and how their relationship had developed slowly from friendship to something deeper. "The beautiful thing about falling in love later in life," she said during one of our conversations, "is that you know yourself well enough to recognize what's real and what's just loneliness or convenience. Robert and I don't need each other in the desperate way young people do. We choose each other every day, and that choice feels more precious because we know how rare it is to find someone worth choosing." She also told me about the resistance they had faced from both their families, the assumptions people made about older adults and sexuality, the suggestion that they should be content with companionship without the complications of romance. "My son actually suggested we just be friends," she said with a laugh. "As if passion has an expiration date." Through Eleanor, I began to understand that my experience with online dating, while humiliating, was part of a larger pattern of ageism and sexism that tried to police when and how women were allowed to seek happiness. The cruel comments hadn't been about me specifically. They had been about society's discomfort with older women who refused to disappear gracefully into the background. This realization didn't erase the hurt, but it gave it context. I hadn't been mocked because I was foolish or desperate. I had been mocked because I had dared to assert that my desires mattered, that my life still held possibilities, that being 62 didn't disqualify me from seeking love and partnership. December arrived with an early snowfall that transformed my neighborhood into something magical. I had always loved winter, the way snow muffled sound and made even ordinary scenes look like something from a fairy tale. David and I used to take long walks on snowy evenings, pointing out which houses had the most creative holiday decorations, making up stories about the families inside, planning our own modest celebrations. This year, for the first time since his death, I decided to host Christmas dinner, not for my children who would be with their respective in-laws, but for friends who might otherwise spend the holiday alone. Eleanor and Robert, Sarah and her husband, Miss Chun from the library, and a few other women from my watercolor class, who had become genuine friends rather than just pleasant acquaintances. Planning the dinner gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. I researched recipes, planned menus, shopped for serving pieces I had stored away since David's death. Most importantly, I found myself looking forward to something again, imagining my house filled with laughter and conversation, remembering what it felt like to create joy rather than just endure solitude. The evening of the dinner, as I watched my friends gathered around my dining room table, sharing stories and passing dishes and arguing good-naturedly about politics and books, I felt something shift inside me once again. Not a complete healing, not a return to the naive optimism I had felt when I first created my dating profile, but something quieter and more sustainable. I felt worthy of the love and friendship surrounding me. I felt valuable not just for what I could provide others, but for who I was in my own right. And for the first time in months, I began to believe that maybe Eleanor was right. Maybe my story wasn't over. Maybe the world's attempt to shrink me down to manageable size didn't have to be successful. I still wasn't ready to try dating again. The wounds from my online humiliation were still too fresh, my confidence still too fragile, but I was no longer convinced that wanting more than solitude made me pathetic. I was no longer ashamed of the part of me that longed for partnership, that missed having someone to share both ordinary moments and special occasions with. As my friends prepared to leave that night, Eleanor pulled me aside in the kitchen. "This was beautiful. You have a gift for bringing people together. Thank you for encouraging me to try," I said. I wasn't sure I could pull it off. "Oh, my dear," she said with a knowing smile, "I have a feeling you're going to pull off much more than a dinner party before this story is finished. You're just getting started." I didn't know what she meant at the time, but her words stayed with me as I cleaned up the kitchen and prepared for bed. For the first time in months, I felt like someone who was moving forward rather than just marking time. I felt like someone with possibilities ahead of her rather than just memories behind her. I had no idea that within 2 weeks, those possibilities would begin to manifest in ways I never could have imagined, ways that would vindicate every hope I had dared to harbor and silence every voice that had tried to convince me my dreams were too big for a woman my age. The new year arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made everything feel possible again. January had always been my favorite month, not for the resolutions that most people made and abandoned by February, but for the sense of renewal that came with fresh snow and longer days, and the quiet promise that winter wouldn't last forever. This January felt different though, charged with an energy I hadn't experienced in years. My watercolor class had reconvened after the holiday break, and I found myself looking forward to Tuesday afternoons with an enthusiasm that surprised me. The instructor, a soft-spoken woman named Patricia who wore flowing scarves and had paint permanently embedded under her fingernails, had been encouraging us to move beyond the safe landscapes and still lifes we had been practicing. "Art requires vulnerability," she said during our first class of the new year. "If you're not willing to risk making something terrible, you'll never make something extraordinary. Her words resonated with me in ways that had nothing to do with painting. I had spent the last few months playing it safe, making myself smaller, avoiding risks that might lead to disappointment or humiliation. But safety, I was beginning to understand, was just another kind of prison, one with comfortable walls and familiar routines, but no windows to let in new light. I began experimenting with bolder colors, abstract compositions that captured emotions rather than realistic representations. My paintings were terrible at first, muddy and confused, but there was something liberating about creating something that didn't have to please anyone but me. I painted the loneliness I had felt after David's death, dark blues and grays that seemed to swirl and sink into themselves. I painted the humiliation of the online mockery, angry reds and harsh blacks that scraped across the paper like accusation. But I also painted hope, soft yellows and warm oranges that seemed to glow from within the paper. I painted the friendship I had found with Eleanor, two figures sitting close together, their colors bleeding into each other in ways that suggested connection without losing individuality. And slowly, tentatively, I began to paint the possibility of love again, not as something desperate or needy, but as something that could be beautiful and natural and worthy of pursuit. It was during one of these painting sessions that I met James Morrison, though I didn't know his name yet, and certainly had no idea of the role he would play in completely transforming my understanding of what the next chapter of my life could look like. He had wandered into the community center's art room by mistake, looking for the meeting room where his own class was supposed to convene, and found himself surrounded by easels and women in paint-splattered aprons, wielding brushes like weapons. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice carrying just a hint of an accent I couldn't immediately place. "I'm looking for the photography workshop. I seem to have made a wrong turn." Patricia looked up from where she was helping Mrs. Chen blend colors for a sunset she was painting from memory. "Photography meets in room 210, up one flight and down the hall to the left," she said, "though you're welcome to stay and try your hand at watercolors if you'd like." He smiled, and I noticed that it was the kind of smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners in a way that suggested someone who laughed often and genuinely. He was probably in his late 60s, tall and lean with silver hair that looked like he had run his fingers through it, wearing a sweater the color of forest moss, and carrying a camera bag that showed signs of frequent use. "That's very tempting," he said, his gaze sweeping across our various works in progress, "but I'm afraid I'd be starting from absolute zero. I can barely manage stick figures. Most of us started from zero too," I found myself saying, surprising myself by speaking up. "Some of us are still working on it." He looked at me then, really looked, not the polite glance that most people my age had learned to give each other, but the kind of attention that suggested genuine interest. "What are you working on?" he asked, stepping closer to my easel. I had been painting something abstract, layers of color that I thought might represent transformation, though I wasn't entirely sure what it would become when it was finished. "I'm not exactly sure yet," I admitted. "I'm still figuring it out as I go." "That sounds like the best kind of art," he said, "and possibly the best kind of life." Before I could respond, he was gone, having realized he was already late for his own class. But his words stayed with me as I continued working on my painting, adding touches of gold to the swirling colors, thinking about the difference between planning every detail and allowing room for discovery. Over the next few weeks, I found myself arriving at the community center a few minutes early, hoping to catch a glimpse of the photography class participants as they filed into their meeting room. I told myself I was just curious about what other kinds of creative pursuits people our age were exploring, but I knew I was really hoping to see the man with the kind smile and the observant eye. Eleanor noticed my increased attention to my appearance on class days, the way I had started wearing my nicer sweaters and taking more care with my hair. "You're glowing," she said one afternoon as we sat in our usual corner of the library cafe, after class. "Something's different about you." "I've been feeling more like myself lately," I said, which was true, even if it wasn't the complete truth. "The painting has been good for me, and perhaps something else has been good for you."
she asked with the knowing look of someone who had spent 75 years observing human nature. I told her about the brief encounter with the man from the photography class, feeling slightly foolish for reading so much into such a minor interaction. Eleanor listened with the serious attention she gave to all matters of the heart, nodding thoughtfully, as I described the way he had looked at my painting with genuine interest, rather than polite dismissal. "Have you seen him since?" she asked. "Not to talk to," I admit. "I may have timed my arrival to coincide with when his class ends, but we haven't actually spoken again." Eleanor smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose matchmaking instincts had been confirmed. "May, you realize you're interested in this man?" The statement hung between us like a question I wasn't ready to answer. Was I interested? The possibility felt both thrilling and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a diving board and trying to decide whether the water below was deep enough to be safe. "I don't know if I'm ready," I said finally. "After what happened with the dating profile, I'm not sure I can handle putting myself out there again." "Who says you have to put yourself out there?" Eleanor asked. "Maybe this time, you can just be yourself and see what happens naturally." The idea of natural progression, of allowing something to develop organically rather than through the artificial construct of online profiles and digital matchmaking, appealed to me in ways I hadn't expected. There was something to be said for the old-fashioned approach of meeting someone in person, of building attraction based on real interactions, rather than carefully curated photos and strategically written descriptions. But natural progression required opportunity, and I couldn't engineer casual encounters without seeming obvious or desperate. I had to content myself with the possibility that our paths might cross again, and if they didn't, perhaps that was a sign that I wasn't ready for whatever might come next. The opportunity presented itself 2 weeks later in the most mundane way possible. I was leaving my watercolor class on a particularly cold February afternoon when I realized I had forgotten my gloves in the classroom. By the time I retrieved them and made my way back to the main entrance, the photography class was ending, and I found myself walking toward the parking lot at the same time as the man I had been quietly hoping to see again. "The watercolor artist," he said when he noticed. "How is your mysterious painting coming along?" "Still mysterious," I said, pleased that he had remembered our brief conversation, "though I think it might be becoming something that looks like spring, if spring were a feeling rather than a season." "That sounds like the most honest kind of art," he said. "I'm James, by the way, James Morrison, May Thompson," I replied, and when he offered his hand, I noticed that his fingers were long and elegant, the hands of someone who created things with care and precision. "It's nice to officially meet you, May Thompson. Are you parked in the north lot? I'd be happy to walk with you. These icy patches are treacherous." We walked slowly across the parking lot, and I found myself hoping for more ice than was probably safe, anything to extend this unexpected conversation. He told me about his photography class, how he had taken it up after retiring from a career in business consulting, how he was still learning to see light and composition in ways that translated into compelling images. "What kind of consulting did you do?" I asked, genuinely curious about this man, who seemed to have reinvented himself as an artist in retirement. "Corporate restructuring, mainly," he said. "I spent 40 years helping companies figure out how to do more with less, how to streamline operations and maximize efficiency. It was rewarding work, but not exactly creative." "And now you're learning to see the world through a camera lens," I said. "That must be quite a change." "The biggest change is slowing down enough to notice what's actually worth capturing," he said. "I spent so many years moving fast, focusing on the next deadline or the next client, that I forgot to pay attention to the details that make life beautiful." We had reached my car, and I found myself reluctant to end the conversation. "What's your favorite thing to photograph?" I asked, fishing for a reason to keep talking. "Honestly, people who are completely absorbed in what they're doing," he said. "There's something magical about capturing someone in a moment when they're not performing or posing, just being authentically themselves." "That sounds like it requires patience," I said, "and probably some skill at being invisible." "Both," he agreed, Though I'm learning that being invisible isn't always the goal, sometimes the best photos happen when people know you're there but trust you enough to let their guard down There was something in the way he said it that made me wonder if we were still talking about photography, or if we had moved into some deeper territory about vulnerability and trust, and the courage required to let someone see you as you really are. I should let you get out of this cold, he said, though he made no move to leave. But I hope I'll see you around the community center again. Tuesday afternoons, I said. Watercolor class, Tuesday afternoons, he repeated, as if committing it to memory. Maybe I'll time my arrival a little differently next week. I drove home with a warmth that had nothing to do with the heater in my car. For the first time since the dating profile disaster, I felt the flutter of genuine attraction, the pleasant nervousness that came with wondering what someone thought of you, with hoping you would see them again soon. But this felt different from the calculated hopefulness I had experienced while crafting my online profile. This felt organic, natural, like something that might grow if given the right conditions, rather than something that had to be forced into existence. I called Eleanor as soon as I got home, unable to contain my excitement about the extended conversation with James. She listened to every detail with the enthusiasm of someone who understood exactly how significant it was for me to feel interested in someone again. He sounds lovely, she said when I finished recounting our parking lot conversation, and more importantly, he sounds interested in you. Do you think so? I asked, immediately feeling like a teenager analyzing every word and gesture for hidden meaning. May, the man suggested changing his schedule to see you again. That's not the behavior of someone making polite conversation. The possibility that James might be as intrigued by me as I was by him sent a thrill through me that I had almost forgotten was possible. But it also activated all my fears about putting myself in a position to be hurt or rejected again. What if I was misreading the situation? What if his interest was just friendliness? What if word of my humiliating dating profile experience had somehow reached him, and he was one of those people who found older women's romantic aspirations amusing? What if he finds out about what happened with the dating profile? I asked Ellen. What if he thinks I'm some kind of desperate woman who throws herself at any available man? Then he's not worthy of your time, Eleanor said firmly. But May, you can't let the cruelty of strangers determine how you interact with every new person you meet. That gives those awful people more power over your life than they deserve.
She was right, of course. I had allowed the online humiliation to color every interaction to make me second-guess my worth and my right to pursue happiness. But James didn't know about any of that. To him, I was simply May, a woman he had met in an art class, someone whose painting had intrigued him, whose company he seemed to enjoy. I could choose to approach this potential friendship or whatever it might become from that clean slate, without the baggage of my previous disappointment. The following Tuesday, I arrived at the community center with more care than usual devoted to my appearance. Not dramatic changes, just the good wool slacks instead of my usual jeans, the sweater that Eleanor had said brought out the blue in my eyes, the lipstick I had been saving for special occasions. I wanted to look like someone who took care of herself without looking like someone who was trying too hard. James was waiting outside the photography classroom when I arrived, and his face lit up with what appeared to be genuine pleasure when he saw me. May, perfect timing. I was hoping I might catch you before class. Is everything all right? I asked, immediately worried that something was wrong. Everything's fine, he said quickly. Actually, everything's better than fine. I wanted to ask you something, and I figured it was better to do it in person than to track down your phone number and call out of the blue. My heart started beating faster, though I tried to keep my expression neutral. What did you want to ask? There's a photography exhibition opening at the downtown gallery this Friday evening. Nothing fancy, just local artists, but I thought it might be interesting. Would you like to go with me? We could grab dinner afterward if you're interested. The invitation hung in the air between us, and I realized this was the moment where I had to choose between the safety of polite decline and the risk of saying yes to possibility. Everything in me that had been wounded by the dating profile experience wanted to make excuses, to suggest we just remain casual acquaintances who exchanged pleasantries in parking lots. But the part of me that had been awakened by months of watercolor painting, by Eleanor's example of choosing love over fear, by the growing understanding that my life still held potential for joy and surprise. Spoke before my anxious mind could stop it. I would love to, I said. That sounds wonderful. His smile was immediate and transformative. And I realized he had been nervous too, uncertain whether I would accept his invitation. The knowledge that this confident, interesting man had been anxious about my response made me feel powerful in ways I had forgotten were possible. Excellent, he said. Shall I pick you up around 6? The gallery opening starts at 7, so we'd have time for a leisurely dinner beforehand. 6 would be perfect, I said, giving him my address, and trying not to think about all the ways this could go wrong, focusing instead on the anticipation that was already building in my chest. We parted ways to our respective classes, but I found it impossible to concentrate on my painting that afternoon. My mind kept drifting to Friday evening, to the prospect of spending several hours in James's company, to the question of what I would wear, and whether I remembered how to behave on what was unmistakably a date. A date. The word carried weight and possibility and terror in equal measure. I hadn't been on a date in over 40 years, hadn't had to navigate the delicate dance of getting to know someone with romantic possibilities, since I was a young woman with completely different concerns and insecurities. What did dating look like at 62? What were the expectations, the boundaries, the unspoken rules that governed how people our age approached new relationships? I spent the rest of the week alternating between excitement and panic, consulting with Eleanor about everything from outfit choices to conversation topics. She was endlessly patient with my questions, sharing stories from her own return to dating, and reminding me that the goal wasn't to be perfect, but to be authentically myself. The beautiful thing about dating at our age, she said during one of our coffee conversations, is that you're not trying to become someone different to attract a partner. You're fully formed, you know who you are and what you want. The question is just whether you and James are compatible, not whether you can transform yourself into someone he might find attractive. Her perspective helped calm some of my anxiety, but I still spent Friday afternoon trying on half the contents of my closet before settling on a simple black dress that was elegant without being formal, paired with a silk scarf the color of deep emeralds that had been a gift from David years earlier. I wore his wedding ring on my right hand, a gesture that felt like carrying his blessing rather than clinging to the past. James arrived exactly at 6, looking distinguished in a navy blazer and carrying a small bouquet of white tulips. These reminded me of your painting style, he said when he handed them to me. Clean and beautiful and full of possibility. The gesture was so thoughtful, so clearly chosen with care rather than grabbed from a grocery store display, that I felt my remaining nervousness begin to ease. This was a man who paid attention to details, who remembered things that mattered, who approached even small gestures with consideration. They're beautiful, I said, arranging them quickly in a vase before we left. Thank you for thinking of me. I've been thinking of you quite a bit actually, he said, and the honesty in his voice made me look at him more closely. I hope that's not too forward to admit. Not too forward at all, I said. I've been thinking of you too. We drove to the restaurant in his car, a well-maintained sedan that smelled faintly of leather and the kind of subtle cologne that suggested good taste rather than trying too hard. The conversation flowed easily, moving from observations about the city's recent development projects, to stories from our respective careers, to shared memories of how different the world had been when we were younger. Over dinner at a small Italian place that clearly prioritized quality over trendiness, I learned that James had been widowed for 3 years, that he had 2 adult children who lived in different states, that he had taken up photography as a way of learning to see beauty again after the darkness of his wife's long illness and death. The hardest part wasn't losing her, he said, his voice careful as he navigated the delicate territory of discussing previous love with someone new. It was remembering how to live instead of just surviving. For a long time I felt guilty about wanting anything beyond basic functioning. His words resonated so deeply with my own experience that I found myself sharing more than I had planned about my own journey through widowhood, about the years of focusing solely on work and children, about the recent realization that surviving wasn't the same as living full. I tried online dating a few months ago, I heard myself saying, and immediately regretted the admission. Why was I bringing up my most humiliating experience on what was turning out to be a lovely evening? How did that go? He asked, his tone neutral and genuinely curious rather than judgmental. I could have deflected, could have given a vague answer about it not being the right approach for me. Instead, I found myself telling him the whole story, the cruel comments, my daughter's betrayal, the way the experience had made me question my worth and my right to seek companionship. James listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious as I described the level of mockery I had endured. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and I braced myself for him to make excuses and end the evening early. "I'm sorry that happened to you," he said, finally. "People can be incredibly cruel when they're protected by anonymity and distance. But May, I hope you know that their cruelty says nothing about you, and everything about their own fears and limitations." "Their fears?" I asked, surprised by his perspective. "I think people mock what they're afraid of," he said, thoughtfully, "and I think a lot of people are afraid of aging, afraid of being alone, afraid of the idea that desire and hope don't automatically expire at a certain age. When they see someone like you being brave enough to put yourself out there, it forces them to confront their own fears about what their future might hold." His analysis reframed the entire experience in a way that made me feel less like a victim, and more like someone who had been brave enough to threaten the status quo. "I hadn't thought about it that way," I said. "You were brave," he said simply. "It takes courage to hope for more, especially after loss. The fact that some people responded to your courage with cruelty doesn't diminish the bravery of the act itself." By the time we left the restaurant for the gallery opening, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not just because of James's kindness, though that was certainly part of it, but because of the way he had helped me see my own experience through a different lens. I hadn't been foolish or desperate, I had been brave and hopeful, and those were qualities worth celebrating rather than hiding. The gallery was small and intimate, filled with photographs that captured moments of ordinary life transformed by exceptional light and composition. James moved through the exhibition with the careful attention of someone who understood the technical challenges behind each image, pointing out details I would have missed, and sharing insights about how certain effects had been achieved. But I found myself watching him as much as the photographs, noticing the way his face changed when he encountered something that moved him, the way he gave each piece the respect of real consideration rather than polite glance. Here was someone who approached art, approached life, with the kind of attention and appreciation that made everything richer. "What do you think of this one?" he asked, stopping in front of a black and white photograph of an elderly couple dancing in what appeared to be their kitchen, her head on his shoulder, his hand gentle on her back, both of them lost in the music and the moment. "It's beautiful," I said, though the word felt inadequate for the emotion the image evoked. "They look like they've been dancing together for decades." 57 years, James said, reading from the small placard beside the photograph. "The photographer is their granddaughter. She says she took this during their last Christmas together before he passed away." I felt tears prick at my eyes, not from sadness but from the profound beauty of love that endured, that found expression in small moments, that remained vital and meaningful even in the face of time and loss. "That's what I want," I said without thinking, and then immediately felt embarrassed by the admission. "What do you want?" James asked gently. "That," I said, gesturing toward the photograph, "the kind of love that's still dancing in the kitchen after 57 years. The kind that doesn't diminish with age but deepens, becomes more precious because you know how rare it is." James studied the photograph for another moment, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I think that's what we all want," he said. "The question is whether we're brave enough to believe it's still possible." "Are you?" I asked. "Brave enough to believe it's still possible?" "I'm starting to be," he said, "especially tonight." We stayed at the gallery until it closed, moving slowly through the remaining exhibits, our conversation deepening as the evening progressed. By the time James walked me to my door, I felt like I had been on the best first date of my life, even though it was technically only the second first date I had ever experienced. "I had a wonderful time tonight," he said as we stood on my front porch. "Would you be interested in doing this again? Maybe something less formal next time, a hike, or a visit to the farmer's market, or just coffee and a walk around the lake." "Any of those sound perfect," I said. "All of them, actually." He smiled and leaned forward to kiss my cheek, a gesture that was gentle and respectful. and yet charged with enough possibility to make my heart race. "I'll call you tomorrow," he said. "If that's not too soon." "Not too soon at all," I said, watching him walk back to his car with the kind of anticipation I had thought belonged to my past. Inside my house, I hung up my coat and touched the spot on my cheek where he had kissed me, marveling at how different this felt from the anxious hopefulness I had experienced while crafting my online dating profile. This felt natural, organic, like something that could grow into whatever it was meant to become without forcing or rushing or trying to fit into predetermined categories. I fell asleep that night thinking about the photograph of the elderly couple dancing in their kitchen, about James's gentle hands and thoughtful conversation, about the possibility that my story of love might not be over after all. I dreamed of spring gardens and camera lenses that captured light in ways that made ordinary moments look magical, and for the first time in months, I woke up eager to see what the day might bring. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came a transformation in my life that I couldn't have imagined just months before. James and I had been seeing each other regularly for 6 weeks, and what had begun as tentative coffee dates and afternoon walks had evolved into something deeper and more meaningful than I had dared to hope for. We had settled into a comfortable rhythm of spending time together several times a week, exploring art galleries and hiking trails, cooking dinner in each other's kitchens, and having the kind of long conversations that made hours pass like minutes. It was during one of these dinners at his house, a beautiful modern home overlooking the valley that he had purchased after his wife's death, that I began to understand there was much more to James Morrison than the retired business consultant and amateur photographer I had initially met. I had arrived to find him on a conference call that was running longer than expected, and he gestured apologetically toward the kitchen while he finished discussing what sounded like complex financial projections with someone on the other end of the line. While I waited, I wandered through his living room, admiring the photography prints he had matted and framed, the carefully curated collection of books that ranged from technical manuals on digital imaging to classic literature to what appeared to be several volumes on international business law. But it was the collection of awards and recognitions displayed on a built-in bookshelf that made me stop and look more closely. There were plaques from organizations I recognized as major players in the corporate world, awards for excellence in strategic consulting and business transformation, a crystal sculpture engraved with his name, and the title Consultant of the Year from an association I knew handled multi-million-dollar corporate restructuring projects. Several framed letters of commendation from companies whose names I recognized from news headlines, thanking him for his work on mergers and acquisitions that had saved thousands of jobs and generated hundreds of millions in value. Most intriguingly, there was a photograph of James shaking hands with a man I was certain I had seen on the cover of business magazines, both of them standing in front of what appeared to be a massive industrial facility. The caption at the bottom read, "Morrison Strategic Solutions celebrates successful completion of the Northridge Manufacturing Turnaround Project." Morrison Strategic Solutions. I had heard that name before, though I couldn't immediately place. It wasn't until James emerged from his study, apologizing profusely for the extended call, that I realized I might have significantly underestimated the scope of his professional background. "I'm so sorry about that," he said, loosening his tie and looking genuinely frustrated by the interruption. "One of my former clients is facing a regulatory challenge, and they asked if I could review their compliance strategy. I should have told them to call tomorrow, but old habits die hard." "Former clients?" I asked, gesturing toward the awards I had been examining. "James, these look like they represent some pretty significant work." He glanced at the display with what seemed like embarrassment rather than pride. "Corporate consulting can be lucrative if you're willing to take on the challenging cases," he said. "I spent most of my career working with companies that were in crisis, helping them restructure operations and avoid bankruptcy. It was rewarding work but incredibly demanding." "Morrison Strategic Solutions," I said, testing the name. "That was your company?" "Still is, technically," he said. "Though I stepped back from day-to-day operations when my wife got sick, my business partner handles most of the active cases now, and I only consult on projects that specifically request my involvement." The casual way he mentioned still owning a strategic consulting firm that apparently worked with major corporations suggested a level of success and influence that went far beyond what I had understood about his background.
But James seemed uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, quickly steering us toward dinner preparations, and asking about my week at the library and art class. It wasn't until several days later when Eleanor and I were having our regular coffee and I mentioned the awards I had seen at James's house, that I began to understand the full scope of what I had stumbled upon. Morrison Strategic Solutions, Eleanor repeated thoughtfully. Why does that sound familiar? She pulled out her phone and typed the name into a search engine, her eyebrows rising as she read the results. May, do you realize who you're dating? James Morrison, retired business consultant and amateur photographer, I said, though her expression suggested I was missing something significant. James Morrison, founder and CEO of one of the most successful corporate turnaround firms in the country, she corrected, turning her phone so I could see the screen. According to this, Morrison Strategic Solutions has handled over $2 billion in corporate restructuring projects. He's been featured in Fortune magazine, The Wall Street Journal, and Forbes. There's an entire Wikipedia page about his work in corporate crisis management. I stared at the screen, scrolling through article headlines that describe James as the corporate miracle worker and the man who saves dying companies. There were photographs of him in business suits, looking serious and confident in boardrooms and at industry conferences. One article described a project where his intervention had saved a failing automotive parts manufacturer, preserving over 3,000 jobs and generating enough profit to expand operations into international markets. This says his net worth is estimated in the tens of millions, Eleanor continued, her voice filled with amazement. May, you're not just dating a successful businessman, you're dating one of the most influential corporate consultants in the region. The information felt surreal, like discovering that someone you thought you knew well was actually a character from a completely different story. The gentle man who brought me tulips and listened patiently to my concerns about aging and loneliness was apparently also a business titan who commanded enormous fees for his expertise and whose recommendations could determine the fate of entire companies. He never mentioned any of this, I said, trying to reconcile the James of new with the powerful executive described in these articles. He talks about his consulting work like it was a modest career, nothing special. Maybe that's exactly why he's special, Eleanor said thoughtfully. How many wealthy, successful men do you know who would downplay their achievements when trying to impress a woman? Most would lead with their accomplishments. She was right, of course. In retrospect, there had been subtle signs of James's wealth and influence that I had either missed or misinterpreted. The beautiful house, the expensive camera equipment, the way he never seemed concerned about the cost of dinners or gallery admissions, the casual mention of traveling to Europe for photography workshop. But he had presented all of these things as the simple pleasures of a comfortable retirement, not as evidence of extraordinary success. What are you going to do with this information? Eleanor asked. It was a fair question. Part of me felt deceived, as if James had been presenting a false version of himself, though I couldn't identify anything he had actually lied about. He had described himself as a retired business consultant, which was technically accurate even if it was wildly understated. He had mentioned that his work had been lucrative, which was apparently a significant understatement, but not technically untrue. More troubling was the question of why he had chosen to minimize his accomplishment. Was he concerned that I would be interested in him for his money rather than his character? Did he worry that his success would intimidate me or create an uncomfortable power imbalance in our relationship? Or was he simply tired of being defined by his professional achievements, and hoping to connect with someone who would appreciate him for who he was, rather than what he had accomplished? I decided to address the situation directly the next time we were together, which turned out to be that Saturday when we had planned to visit a local farmer's market, and then spend the afternoon at a nearby sculpture garden. I waited until we were walking through the market, examining heirloom tomatoes and artisanal cheeses, before bringing up what I had discovered. I looked up Morrison Strategic Solutions online, I said as we paused at a stand selling fresh flowers. You've been rather modest about your professional accomplishments. James stopped walking and turned to face me, his expression immediately becoming more serious. I wondered when that would come up, he said. I probably should have been more forthcoming from the beginning. Should you? I asked. I'm not sure there's a protocol for revealing that you're apparently one of the most successful business consultants in the country. He smiled ruefully. When you put it that way, it does sound rather pretentious. But May, I need you to understand why I didn't lead with my resume. After my wife died, I discovered that my professional reputation preceded me in ways that made it difficult to form genuine relationships. People either wanted something from me, or they assumed I would want something from them that they couldn't provide. We found a bench in the market's small seating area and sat down, the conversation requiring more privacy than we could manage while walking among the vendors. James explained that in the 3 years since his wife's death, he had tried dating a few times, always with disastrous results. Women either seemed interested primarily in his wealth and status, or they seemed intimidated by his success and convinced they weren't sophisticated enough for someone of his stature. I learned to dread the moment when someone discovered what I did for a living, he said. It changed everything about how they interacted with me. Suddenly they were either performing for me or pulling away from me, but they were never just being themselves anymore. And with me, I asked, with you I got to be James who takes photography classes and struggles to paint anything better than stick figures, he said. James who enjoys long conversations about books and art and the challenges of starting over later in life. James who is nervous about asking you to dinner and worried about whether you would find him interesting enough to see again. His explanation made perfect sense, and I found myself appreciating his choice to reveal himself gradually rather than leading with his achievement. But it also raised questions about our future that I wasn't sure how to address. What did it mean to be in a relationship with someone whose professional success so far exceeded anything I had experienced? How would his wealth and influence change the dynamic between us as our relationship deepened? Are you concerned about the difference in our financial situations? I asked, deciding to address the elephant in the room directly. Are you? He countered. I considered the question seriously. My retirement was comfortable but modest, based on my pension from the library and the proceeds from David's life insurance policy. I owned my home outright, and had enough saved to maintain my current lifestyle indefinitely, but I was not wealthy by any conventional definition. James, according to the articles Eleanor had shown me, was worth tens of millions of dollars and apparently still earned substantial consulting fees from his ongoing projects.
I'm concerned about maintaining my independence, I said finally. I don't want to become someone who expects you to pay for everything, but I also can't afford to keep up with a lifestyle that matches your income level. I don't want you to keep up with anything, James said. One of the things I love about you is that you've built a life that brings you joy without requiring extraordinary resources. Your garden, your painting, your volunteer work, your friendships, these aren't expensive pursuits, but they're meaningful ones. I hope you never change that. One of the things I love about you. The phrase hung between us, significant not just for its content, but for being the first time either of us had used the word love in reference to our relationship. I felt a warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine and everything to do with the realization that this extraordinary man was falling in love with me. Not despite my modest circumstances, but because of the way I had chosen to live my life. For what it's worth, I said, I'm falling in love with you too. Not because of your professional success, which is impressive but not why I'm here. Because of the way you listen when I talk about my painting, and the way you remember details about my grandchildren, even though you've never met them, and the way you made me feel brave enough to hope for companionship again. We kissed for the first time right there on the bench in the farmer's market, surrounded by the scent of fresh herbs and the gentle bustle of Saturday morning shopper. It was a kiss that felt like a promise, not just of romance, but of partnership between two people who had found each other at a stage of life when they thought such discoveries were no longer possible. The weeks that followed brought a deepening of our relationship and a gradual introduction to the reality of James's continued professional involvement. I learned that while he had stepped back from the day-to-day operations of Morrison Strategic Solutions, he still consulted on major projects that specifically requested his expertise. These weren't small assignments, they were multi-million-dollar engagements with Fortune 500 companies facing existential crises. I began to understand the scope of his influence when his phone rang during one of our dinner dates, and I listened to him calmly discuss a strategy for saving a major retail chain from bankruptcy. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, and throughout it, James asked probing questions, offered specific recommendations, and spoke with the kind of authority that suggested the fate of thousands of jobs might depend on his analysis. "How do you handle that kind of pressure?" I asked after he hung up. "Knowing that your recommendations could determine whether entire companies survive or fail. Experience helps," he said. "But mostly I've learned to focus on the data rather than the emotion. Companies fail for predictable reasons, and they can usually be saved if you're willing to make difficult decisions quickly enough." His matter-of-fact approach to corporate crisis management was both impressive and slightly intimidating. This was a man who operated at a level of business I had never encountered, making decisions that affected thousands of people and millions of dollars with the calm confidence of someone who had been doing it for decades. But it was also becoming clear that his success came with costs that went beyond the demands of the work itself. James received calls at all hours from executives facing crises who needed immediate consultation. His expertise was in such demand that he could command enormous fees, but it also meant he was constantly being pulled back into a world he was trying to leave behind. "Do you miss it?" I asked one evening as we sat on his deck, overlooking the valley, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The intensity, the high-stakes decision-making, being at the center of major corporate dramas. "I miss the intellectual challenge," he admitted. "There's something addictive about taking a complex, seemingly impossible situation and finding the path through it. But I don't miss the stress, or the travel, or the way it consumed every aspect of my life." "What made you decide to step back?" His expression grew more serious, and I could see him choosing his words carefully. "When Sarah was diagnosed with cancer, I realized I had spent 40 years building a career that was impressive but not sustainable. I was traveling constantly, working 18-hour days, missing family dinners and vacations, and all the small moments that actually make life meaningful. I told myself I was building something important, providing for our future, but really, I was just addicted to being needed by powerful people. And after she died, I realized that no amount of professional success could fill the emptiness left by losing the person you love most. I had built this enormously successful company, accumulated more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes, and none of it mattered, because I was alone." His honesty about the limitations of professional achievement, even extraordinary achievement, helped me understand why he had been so careful to downplay his success when we first met. He had learned through painful experience that career accomplishments, no matter how impressive, were poor substitutes for genuine human connection. It was around this time that Claire called with news that would unexpectedly bring James's background into conflict with my family's assumptions about my romantic choices. She had been planning a visit for Mother's Day weekend, her first trip home since the dating profile debacle. And I had been looking forward to the opportunity to rebuild our relationship on more honest ground. "I'm bringing Brad and the kids," she said during our planning call. "And Mom, I want to apologize again for what happened with the dating profile. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I realize I handled it badly." Her acknowledgement of responsibility was more than I had expected, and I felt a surge of hope that we might be able to repair the damage her betrayal had caused to our relationship. "I appreciate that, Claire. It hurt more than you probably realized." "I know, and I'm sorry. But I also want you to know that I'm glad you're doing better now. You sound happier than you have since Dad died." I had been debating whether to tell her about James, and her comment seemed to open the door to sharing news that I hoped would demonstrate that my desire for companionship had not been the foolish fantasy she had suggested it was. "Actually, I've been seeing someone," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. "His name is James, and we met at the community center. He's been wonderful company." There was a pause that lasted just long enough to make me wonder if the connection had been lost. "Seeing someone?" Claire repeated. Like dating, I confirmed. "We've been together for a couple of months now, and I'm very happy." "Oh," she said, and I could hear the wheels turning as she processed this information. "Well, that's great, Mom. I'm glad you found someone. What does he do?" The question was casual enough, but I could detect the underlying concern about whether I was being taken advantage of by someone who might be interested in my modest assets, or simply looking for a convenient companion to take care of him. "He's retired from business consulting," I said, sticking to the simplified version that James preferred. He's taken up photography as a hobby, and he's very kind and intelligent. That sounds nice, Claire said, though her tone suggested she was reserving judgment until she could evaluate this new development for herself. Maybe we'll get to meet him while we're visiting. I had been hoping for exactly that opportunity, both to show Claire that my judgment in romantic matters was better than she had assumed, and to introduce James to the family members who mattered most to me. I'd like that very much, I said. I think you'll find him impressive. I had no idea how prophetic that statement would prove to be, or how dramatically Claire's assumptions about my dating choices were about to be challenged by the reality of who James Morrison actually was. The opportunity for that introduction came sooner than expected when James called the next day to invite me to a charity gala that was being held the following Saturday evening. Morrison Strategic Solutions was a major sponsor of the event, which benefited a foundation that provided business training and microloans to women entrepreneurs in developing countries. I normally avoid these functions, he said, but the foundation does important work, and my business partner thinks it's good for the company to maintain a visible presence in the philanthropic community. Would you be interested in accompanying me? The invitation was both thrilling and terrifying. A charity gala sponsored by his company would presumably be attended by other business leaders, wealthy philanthropists, and influential community members. It would be my first introduction to the world where James was known not as a retired amateur photographer, but as a highly successful corporate consultant. It sounds wonderful, I said, but I should probably warn you that I don't have much experience with formal events like that. Neither do I, really, he said with a laugh. I spent 40 years attending business dinners and corporate receptions. But this is different. It's supposed to be enjoyable rather than obligatory. What should I wear? I asked, immediately worried about whether my wardrobe contained anything appropriate for such an event. Whatever makes you feel beautiful and confident, he said, though if you want guidance, the invitation mentions cocktail attire, which I believe means dressy but not quite formal. After we hung up, I called Eleanor in a panic, explaining that I needed help finding something to wear to a charity gala, and had less than a week to accomplish this seemingly impossible task. She immediately offered to take me shopping, and we spent Thursday afternoon exploring boutiques and department stores until we found a navy blue dress with subtle beading that was elegant without being ostentatious, paired with shoes I could actually walk in and a wrap that Eleanor insisted made me look like someone who belonged at sophisticated events. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of nervous excitement I hadn't experienced since my first date with James. He picked me up in what I assumed was his formal occasion car, a sleek black sedan that was considerably more luxurious than the comfortable vehicle he usually drove. He was wearing a perfectly tailored tuxedo that made him look like someone from a magazine advertisement, sophisticated and confident in ways that reminded me of the business executive I had discovered in those online articles. "You look absolutely stunning," he said when I opened the door, and the way he looked at me made me feel like the most beautiful woman in the world, regardless of my age or my modest background. The gala was held at the city's most prestigious hotel, and from the moment we arrived, it was clear that this was an event for people who moved in circles very different from any I had ever experienced. The ballroom was decorated with flowers that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and the guests were wearing jewelry and clothing that spoke of wealth and status in ways that made my carefully chosen outfit feel suddenly inadequate. But James moved through this environment with the easy confidence of someone who belonged, greeting other attendees with warm familiarity, introducing me to business leaders and philanthropists with genuine pride in my company. I began to understand that he wasn't just successful in his field, he was respected and admired by people whose names I recognized from newspaper headlines and charity foundation boards. "James Morrison," said a distinguished woman wearing what was clearly a designer gown and diamonds that caught the light like stars. "I was hoping you'd be here tonight. Have you given any more thought to our conversation about the Henderson Industries situation?" "I have," James replied, "and I think we should schedule a meeting next week to discuss strategy options. But tonight, I'd like you to meet May Thompson." "May, this is Victoria Chen, president of the Regional Economic Development Council." Victoria Chen smiled warmly and shook my hand with genuine interest. "It's lovely to meet you, May," James speaks of you often and always with such obvious affection. The evening continued with a series of introductions that gradually revealed the scope of James's professional network and the respect he commanded in the business community. I met bank presidents and foundation directors, successful entrepreneurs and influential attorneys, all of whom clearly held James in high regard and were curious about the woman who had captured his attention. During dinner, I found myself seated next to a woman named Margaret Sinclair, who introduced herself as the president of a corporate foundation that focused on education initiatives. She was perhaps a few years younger than me, impeccably dressed and clearly accustomed to moving in wealthy circles, but her manner was warm and inclusive rather than condescending. "How long have you and James been together?" she asked as we waited for the program to begin. "A few months," I said. "We met at a community center where we both take classes." "How wonderful," she said with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm. "James has been alone too long since Sarah died. We've all been hoping he would find someone special again." "You knew his wife?" "Oh yes, Sarah and I served on several foundation boards together. She was remarkable and she and James were devoted to each other. When she got sick, he stepped back from almost everything to take care of her. It was beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time." Her words gave me a new perspective on James's decision to reduce his professional commitments and focus on personal fulfillment. He hadn't just been burned out by the demands of his career, he had been transformed by the experience of losing someone he loved deeply and realizing that professional achievement was meaningless without personal connection. "He speaks of you with such obvious happiness," Margaret continued. "It's wonderful to see him engaging with life again instead of just going through the motions." The program began before I could respond, but her comments stayed with me throughout the evening. I was beginning to understand that my relationship with James wasn't just personally significant for both of us, it was being noticed and celebrated by a community of people who cared about his well-being and were pleased to see him finding joy again. The event itself was impressive, featuring speakers who discussed the foundation's work in providing business training and financial support to women entrepreneurs in countries where such opportunities were rare. James was introduced as one of the foundation's founding supporters and was invited to say a few words about why he believed in their mission. Watching him speak confidently to an audience of several hundred people, articulating his passion for creating economic opportunities in underserved communities, I saw yet another dimension of who he was beyond the gentle man I had fallen in love with. This was James, the business leader, the strategic thinker, the philanthropist who used his success to create positive change in the world. "Economic development isn't just about creating jobs," he said from the podium, his voice carrying easily through the large ballroom. "It's about creating hope, opportunity, and the kind of stability that allows families and communities to thrive. The women this foundation supports aren't just building businesses, they're building futures for themselves and their children." The audience responded with the kind of sustained applause that suggested genuine respect for both his message and his commitment to the cause. As I watched him acknowledge their appreciation with gracious humility, I felt a pride that went beyond personal affection. This was a man who had achieved extraordinary professional success and was using that success to make a meaningful difference in the world. After the formal program ended and we moved into the reception area for coffee and continued conversation, I found myself approached by several people who were curious about James's obviously special companion. Their questions were polite and genuinely interested, and I gradually relaxed into conversations about my volunteer work, my painting, and my life in the community. It was during one of these conversations that I overheard something that would prove significant in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Two women were standing near the silent auction display, discussing items they were considering bidding on, when their conversation turned to personal topics. "Did you see James Morrison's date tonight?" one of them said in a voice just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "She seems lovely, but I have to say I'm surprised. I would have expected him to choose someone more sophisticated." "What do you mean?" her companion asked. "Oh, I don't mean anything unkind," the first woman quickly clarified. "She's obviously very nice. I just assumed that when James started dating again, it would be with someone from our circle."
Someone who understood his world. I felt heat rise in my face as I realized they were discussing me with the casual assumption that I couldn't hear them or wouldn't understand the implications of their comment. Here I was, less than 3 hours into my introduction to James's professional social circle, already being judged as inadequate for his elevated status. But before I could decide how to respond, I heard a voice I recognized as Margaret Sinclair's joining their conversation. I couldn't help overhearing, she said, her tone pleasant but firm, and I have to say I think May is exactly what James needs. She's intelligent, accomplished in her own right, and clearly makes him happy in ways we haven't seen since Sarah died. Sometimes the best match isn't the most obvious one. Of course, the first woman said quickly, clearly embarrassed to have been overheard making disparaging comments. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. I'm sure you didn't, Margaret replied smoothly. It's just that some of us have learned that successful relationships are built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than matching resume entries. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Margaret's defense of me and the gentle but pointed way she had challenged the assumption that I wasn't suitable for James stayed with me for the rest of the evening. Here was someone who barely knew me but was willing to speak up against the kind of social snobbery that suggested a woman's worth could be measured by her professional achievements or her familiarity with wealthy social circles. As we drove home that evening, James asked about my impressions of the event and the people I had met. I told him about the conversations I had enjoyed and the insights I had gained into his philanthropic work, but I didn't mention the overheard criticism or Margaret's defense. Instead, I found myself thinking about how this glimpse into his professional world had given me a fuller understanding of who he was and what he had accomplished. Thank you for inviting me tonight, I said as we pulled into my drive. It was fascinating to see that side of your life, and the Foundation's work sounds incredible. Thank you for coming with me, he replied. I know it was probably overwhelming, meeting so many new people in such a formal setting. It was a little intimidating, I admit, but everyone was very kind, and I'm proud to be with someone who uses his success to make such a positive difference. I'm proud to be with you too, he said, taking my hand and kissing it gently. May, I hope you know that you belonged in that room tonight, not because of anything you accomplished professionally, but because of who you are as a person. You brought warmth and authenticity to conversations that are often superficial, and several people told me how much they enjoyed meeting you. His words were exactly what I needed to hear, addressing insecurities I hadn't even realized I was harboring about whether I could fit into his work. But more than that, they reinforced my growing understanding that James valued me for qualities that had nothing to do with wealth or status, qualities that were inherently mine regardless of my professional background or social connection. As I prepared for bed that night, I found myself thinking about the women who had questioned whether I was sophisticated enough for James, and about Margaret Sinclair's response to their assumption. Tomorrow, Claire would arrive for her Mother's Day visit, bringing with her the same kind of skepticism about my romantic choices that had led to the dating profile humiliation months earlier. But this time, instead of being vulnerable to mockery and dismissal, I would be introducing her to a man whose success and character were unquestionable, whose attention and affection for me were obvious to anyone who cared to notice. The tables were about to turn in ways that would force everyone who had laughed at my desire for companionship to reconsider their assumptions about what a woman my age deserved and could achieve. Claire arrived on Friday afternoon with Brad and the children, pulling into my driveway in their familiar SUV loaded with weekend bags and the various accessories that traveling with young children require. I watched from my kitchen window as my daughter emerged from the passenger seat, looking around the neighborhood with the careful assessment of someone checking to see if anything had changed since her last visit. She looked older than I remembered, more tired around the eyes, though she was still the polished, put-together woman who managed a demanding career while raising 2 active children. At 34, Claire had achieved the kind of life balance that I had never quite mastered when she and Marcus were young, though I could see the strain of maintaining that balance in the careful way she organized everyone's belongings and directed Brad's unloading of their luggage. "Mom," she said when I opened the door, embracing me with the slightly formal affection that had characterized our relationship since the dating profile incident. "You look wonderful. Really wonderful. I could hear the surprise in her voice and I realized that she had been expecting to find me diminished somehow, perhaps struggling with the loneliness that had driven me to seek companionship online. Instead, she was seeing a woman who was clearly thriving, whose skin had the glow that comes from happiness rather than expensive skincare products, whose entire demeanor suggested someone who had found new sources of joy and energy. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said, hugging her back and then kneeling to greet my grandchildren, Emma and Tyler, who had grown noticeably since Christmas. "I've been feeling wonderful. It shows," Brad said, giving me a quick hug as he carried suitcases toward the guest room. "Whatever you've been doing, keep it up." We spent Friday evening in comfortable family mode, cooking dinner together while the children played in the backyard and Brad caught up on work emails in the living room. Claire seemed more relaxed than she had during our strained phone conversations, and I began to hope that we could rebuild the closeness that had been damaged by her betrayal of my trust. It wasn't until Saturday morning, as we sat on the back porch drinking coffee while the children explored my garden, that Claire brought up the subject I had been both anticipating and dreading. "So tell me about this man you've been seeing," she said, settling into the wicker chair across from me with the air of someone prepared for a serious conversation. James Morrison," I said, pleased to be able to speak his name with the warmth and affection I felt whenever I thought about him. "He's been a wonderful addition to my life." "What's he like?" she asked, and I could hear the underlying concern in her voice, the worry that I might be involved with someone who was taking advantage of my loneliness or my modest financial resource. I told her about meeting James at the community center, about our shared interest in art and our long conversations about books and current events. I described his kindness, his intelligence, his thoughtful attention to details that mattered to me. I mentioned his photography hobby and his volunteer work with literacy programs, painting a picture of a man who was decent and interesting without revealing the full scope of his professional accomplishment. "He sounds very nice," Claire said when I finished, though her tone suggested she was waiting for more substantial information. "What did he do before he retired?" "Business consulting," I said, sticking to the simplified version that James preferred for casual conversation. "He helped companies improve their operations and solve strategic problems." "That's pretty vague," Claire observed. "What kind of companies, local businesses or larger operations?" I could see that she was probing for information that would help her assess whether James was financially stable, whether he might be interested in me for my modest assets, whether he was the kind of man who could provide the security and companionship that her mother deserved. Her questions were motivated by genuine concern rather than nosiness, but they also reflected the assumptions about older men and their motivations that had contributed to the skepticism about my dating effort. "He worked with corporations facing financial difficulties," I said, which was technically accurate even if it failed to convey the scale and prestige of his client base. "He has a reputation for helping companies avoid bankruptcy and preserve jobs." "Well, that sounds responsible," she said, relaxing slightly, "and you feel like you can trust him. He's not pushing for anything inappropriate or trying to move too fast." Her concern about my vulnerability to romantic exploitation was both touching and slightly insulting, suggesting that she saw me as someone who might be easily manipulated by any man who showed interest. But I understood that her worry came from love, even if it was informed by ageist assumptions about older women and their romantic judgment.
"Claire, I'm 62, not 92, I said gently. "I haven't lost my ability to evaluate character or make sound decisions about relationships. James has been nothing but respectful and considerate." I know," she said quickly. "I just worry about you being alone, and I want to make sure that anyone you get involved with has good intentions." "His intentions seem to be enjoying my company and building a meaningful relationship with someone he cares about," I said. "Which are exactly my intentions as well." We were interrupted by Emma running up to the porch with a handful of tulips she had picked from my garden, and the conversation shifted to safer topics like the children's school activities and Claire's recent promotion at the hospital. But I could sense that she remained curious about James, and I suspected that she would continue to probe for more information throughout the weekend. The opportunity for her curiosity to be satisfied came sooner and more dramatically than either of us expected. James had called Saturday morning to ask if he could stop by that afternoon to bring me some photographs he had printed from our recent visit to the botanical gardens. I had mentioned that my family was visiting and he had expressed interest in meeting them, though we hadn't made specific plans for an introduction. "I don't want to intrude on your family time," he had said, "but if it would be appropriate, I'd love to meet your daughter and her family." "I'd like that very much," I had replied, knowing that meeting James would help Claire understand why I was so happy and would demonstrate that my romantic judgment was better than she had assumed. When the doorbell rang around 3 o'clock Saturday afternoon, I was in the kitchen helping Emma frost cupcakes while Claire supervised Tyler's attempt to build a fort out of couch cushions. Brad was in the backyard assembling a small greenhouse kit that I had been struggling with for weeks, muttering about unclear instructions and missing hardware. "I'll get it," Claire called, wiping her hands on a dish towel as she headed toward the front door. "It's probably the delivery driver with the replacement part for Brad's project." I heard the door open, and then a moment of silence that lasted just long enough to make me wonder if something was wrong. Then I heard Claire's voice, carefully polite but with an undertone of confusion. "Hello. I think you might have the wrong house. I'm Claire Morrison, and we're not expecting anyone." She had given James her married name without realizing the significance, and I felt a moment of panic as I realized that this introduction was happening without my presence or preparation. "Actually, I think I have the right house," I heard James reply in his warm, familiar voice. "I'm James Morrison, and I'm here to see May Thompson. She's expecting me." There was another pause, longer this time, and I could practically hear Claire's mind working as she processed the coincidence of sharing a last name with her mother's boyfriend. "Morrison," she repeated slowly. "That's interesting. What a coincidence." "Is it?" James asked, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Are you related to some Morrisons I should know about?" "My husband is Brad Morrison," Claire said. "We're visiting my mother for Mother's Day weekend." "Then you must be Claire," James said with obvious pleasure. "May talks about you and your children constantly. It's wonderful to finally meet you." I decided it was time to intervene before the conversation became more awkward, so I quickly washed my hands and headed toward the front door, where I found Claire standing with what appeared to be carefully controlled surprise while James waited patiently on the porch, holding a portfolio of photographs and looking slightly concerned about the reception he was receiving. "James," I said, reaching for his hand and drawing him into the foyer. "I'm so glad you could stop by. Claire, this is James Morrison, the man I've been telling you about." "Morrison," Claire repeated again, looking back and forth between James and me as if trying to solve a puzzle. "You have the same last name as my husband. It's not an uncommon name," James said diplomatically, "though I'd be curious to know if there might be a family connection." "What does your husband do?" "He's a software engineer," Claire said. "He works for Integrated Systems downtown." "Ah," James said with interest. "That's actually one of the companies Morrison Strategic Solutions worked with a few years ago. We helped them restructure their operations division after they acquired a smaller firm. Your husband might remember the project." "Morrison Strategic Solutions." I watched Claire's expression change as she processed the name, clearly recognizing it, but not immediately connecting it to the man standing in her mother's foyer. "Morrison Strategic Solutions," she said slowly. "The consulting firm?" "That's right," James said. "Do you know it?" "Brad mentioned working with them," Claire said, her voice taking on a different quality as she began to realize that her mother's boyfriend might be more than the modest retiree she had assumed. "He said they brought in some high-level consultants to oversee the integration project." "It was a complex situation," James said, modestly, "but Brad's team did excellent work implementing the new systems. Please give him my regard." I could see Claire's mind racing as she tried to reconcile a successful consulting firm she had heard Brad mention with the man she had expected to meet as her mother's new companion. Before she could ask more questions, Emma and Tyler came running toward the door, curious about the visitor and covered in frosting from our cupcake decorating project. "You must be Emma and Tyler," James said, kneeling down to their eye level with the easy manner of someone comfortable around children. "Your grandmother has told me so much about you. I brought some pictures I thought you might like to see. He opened his portfolio and showed them photographs of butterflies and flowers from the botanical gardens, explaining how he had captured each image and pointing out details they might have missed. The children were immediately charmed by his attention and his willingness to answer their questions about cameras and photography. While James entertained Emma and Tyler, I noticed Claire watching him with the careful assessment of someone trying to evaluate a situation that had become more complicated than expected. When Brad came in from the backyard, still holding tools and looking frustrated with his greenhouse project, Claire quickly introduced him to James with barely concealed excitement. "Brad, this is James Morrison, from Morrison Strategic Solutions," she said, emphasizing the company name in a way that made it clear she thought this information was significant. "He says he worked with integrated systems a few years ago." Brad's reaction was immediate and dramatic. His expression shifted from polite interest to recognition to something approaching awe as he realized he was meeting the man whose consulting firm had been responsible for one of the most successful corporate restructuring projects in the city's recent history. "James Morrison," he said, setting down his tools and extending his hand with obvious respect. "This is incredible. You probably don't remember me, but I was part of the technical team that implemented your integration recommendations. That project was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. You saved hundreds of jobs and turned the whole company around." "I remember the project well," James said, shaking Brad's hand warmly. "And I definitely remember how impressed we were with the technical team's ability to execute such a complex systems integration under pressure. You and your colleagues made our job much easier." "Are you kidding?" Brad said, his voice filled with the enthusiasm of someone talking to a professional hero. "The way you restructured the operational workflow and identified the redundancy issues, it was like watching a masterclass in strategic thinking. My boss still talks about that project as the gold standard for how consulting should work." I watched this exchange with growing amazement, not just at Brad's obvious admiration for James's professional accomplishments, but at Claire's changing expression as she began to understand exactly who her mother had been dating. The modest retiree she had expected to meet was actually someone whose professional reputation preceded him in ways that commanded immediate respect from her own husband. "James, would you like to stay for dinner?" I asked, wanting to extend the visit and give my family more time to get to know him. "We're just having something simple, but there's plenty." "I'd love to," he said, "if I wouldn't be imposing on your family time." "Not imposing at all," Brad said quickly. "Actually, I'd love to hear more about your work. I've read some of your case studies in business journals. Your approach to corporate crisis management is legendary in our industry." As we moved toward the kitchen to prepare dinner, I noticed Claire pulling out her phone and typing something quickly. I suspected she was Googling Morrison Strategic Solutions, finally doing the research that would reveal the full scope of James's professional achievements and financial success. The confirmation of my suspicions came 20 minutes later when Claire appeared at my side while I was preparing salad, her expression a mixture of shock and embarrassment. "Mom," she said in a low voice, "do you realize who you're dating?" "James Morrison, retired business consultant and amateur photographer," I said with deliberate casualness. "Why?" "Mom, he's not just any business consultant. Morrison Strategic Solutions is one of the most successful corporate turnaround firms in the country. According to what I just read, he's worth tens of millions of dollars and has been featured in Fortune magazine and the Wall Street Journal. He's like a celebrity in the business world." "Is he?" I said, continuing to chop vegetables with studied nonchalance. How interesting," she repeated, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself and lowered it again. "Mom, this man is incredibly successful and influential. Why didn't you tell me?" "You didn't ask about his net worth or his media coverage," I said, finally looking at her direct. "You asked what he was like as a person, and I told you, he's kind, intelligent, thoughtful, and makes me happy. Isn't that more important than his professional achievements?" Claire stared at me for a moment, clearly processing the implications of what she had discovered. "But Mom, Don't you realize what this means? You're not just dating some random guy you met at a community center. You're in a relationship with one of the most successful businessmen in the region. I'm in a relationship with a man who brings me flowers and listens to my stories about painting class and remembers my grandchildren's names, I said firmly. His professional success is impressive, but it's not why I care about him. Of course not, Claire said quickly. But Mom, this changes everything. When you told me you were dating again, I was worried about whether this person would be good enough for you, whether he might be taking advantage of your loneliness. I never imagined you would attract someone of this caliber. Her words stung, even though I understood that they came from a place of love and concern. The assumption that I would be lucky to find any decent man interested in me, much less someone successful and accomplished, reflected the same ageist attitudes that had made my online dating experience so humiliating. Claire, I said, setting down my knife and turning to face her fully, what makes you think I wouldn't attract someone of this caliber? Do you think my age disqualifies me from being interesting to successful men? Do you think I have so little to offer that I should be grateful for anyone who shows interest? No, of course not, she said, backtracking quickly. That's not what I meant. It's just that men like James Morrison usually date women who are, more like them, professional, successful businesswomen or socialites, or people who move in those circles, and yet he chose to date a retired library worker who paints watercolors and volunteers with literacy programs, I said. What does that tell you about what he values in a partner? Before Claire could answer, we were interrupted by laughter from the living room, where James was apparently telling Emma and Tyler stories about some of the more unusual animals he had photographed during his recent travel. The sound of my grandchildren's delighted giggles, mixed with James's warm chuckles, created exactly the kind of family atmosphere I had been hoping for. He's wonderful with the kids, Claire said, her tone shifting from shock to something approaching wonder. Yes, he is, I agreed. He's wonderful with everyone. That's who he is. Claire, not the successful businessman you read about online, but the man who spends Saturday afternoons looking at my amateur paintings and telling me they're beautiful. We finished preparing dinner in companionable silence, and as we called everyone to the table, I noticed how naturally James fit into our family dynamic. He complimented the children on their table manners, asked Brad thoughtful questions about his current projects, and treated Claire with the respectful attention of someone who understood how important she was to me. It was during dessert, as we shared the cupcakes that Emma and Tyler had decorated with more enthusiasm than skill, that the conversation turned to the topic I had been both anticipating and dreading. James, Claire said, her tone carefully casual, I have to ask you something, and I hope you won't think I'm being rude. Of course, he said, giving her his full attention. Ask anything you'd like. When you and Mom started dating, did she know about your professional background, about Morrison's strategic solutions and everything you've accomplished? James glanced at me with a slight smile before answering. Your mother knew I was a retired business consultant, but I didn't lead with my resume if that's what you're asking. I was more interested in getting to know her as a person than in impressing her with my professional achievements. But surely she figured it out eventually, Claire pressed. I mean, a simple internet search would reveal everything. I don't actually spend much time Googling people I'm getting to know, I interjected. I prefer to learn about them through conversation and shared experiences. But when you did find out, Claire continued, addressing both of us, didn't it change things? Didn't it make the relationship feel different? It made me understand why James chose to be modest about his accomplishments, I said. And it made me appreciate even more that he was interested in me for who I am rather than being impressed by my professional status or financial assets, which are considerable in their own right, James added, looking at me with obvious affection. Your mother has built a beautiful life filled with meaningful work, strong relationships, and creative pursuits. She's accomplished in all the ways that actually matter. I felt tears threaten at his words, not because they were particularly eloquent, but because they reflected such a deep understanding of what I valued about my own life. This was what Claire had been unable to see when she mocked my dating profile, that I had things to offer beyond youth and conventional beauty,
that my age and experience might actually be attractive to someone who was looking for depth rather than surface appeal. "I owe you an apology, Mom," Claire said, suddenly, her voice thick with emotion, "about the dating profile, about not supporting you when you decided to try online dating, about not understanding that you deserved to find love again." "Claire, you don't need to," I began, but she held up her hand to stop me. "Yes, I do," she said firmly. "I was wrong about so many things. I was wrong to think that wanting companionship made you desperate. I was wrong to share something private about you without permission. And I was wrong to be embarrassed by my mother's courage instead of being proud of it." "Your mother was incredibly brave," James said quietly. "Putting yourself out there at any age takes courage, but doing it after loss, after being hurt, that takes extraordinary strength." "The people who mocked that profile," Claire continued, her voice growing stronger, "they had no idea who they were talking about. They didn't know they were making fun of a woman who raised 2 successful children while working full-time, who built a career through intelligence and hard work, who volunteers her time to help others, who creates beautiful art, who attracts the attention and devotion of men like James Morrison. They didn't know because they didn't want to know," I said gently. "They wanted to see a desperate older woman. So that's what they saw. But that says more about them than it does about me." "I know that now," Claire said, wiping tears from her eyes. "And I know that I should have defended you instead of being part of the problem. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry." I reached across the table to take her hand, feeling a weight lift from my chest that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. "I forgive you, sweetheart. And I understand why you reacted the way you did. We're all learning how to navigate this stage of life." "What I want to know," Brad said, breaking the emotional tension with the practical curiosity that characterized his approach to everything, "is how those people who made fun of Mom's dating profile would feel if they knew she's in a relationship with James Morris." The question hung in the air, and I found myself thinking about all the cruel comments, about the women who had laughed at the idea of a 62-year-old woman seeking love, about the assumption that my romantic life was over, simply because I had passed some arbitrary age threshold. "I think," James said thoughtfully, "that they would probably feel embarrassed about their assumptions and their cruelty, but more importantly, I hope they would learn something about the dangers of judging people based on age or appearance or any other superficial characteristic." "I hope so too," I said, "but honestly I don't need their apologies or their approval. I have everything I need right here." As if to prove my point, Emma climbed into my lap and offered me a bite of her messily frosted cupcake, while Tyler regaled James with an elaborate story about a butterfly he had seen in the garden. The evening continued with the kind of easy conversation and comfortable silences that marked the best kind of family gatherings, and by the time James prepared to leave, it was clear that he had been fully accepted into our family circle. "Thank you for dinner," he said as we stood on the front porch saying goodbyes, "and thank you for making me feel so welcome. Thank you for being exactly the kind of man my mother deserves," Claire said, giving him a hug that seemed to surprise him with its warmth. "I hope we'll see much more of you." "I hope so too," he replied, looking at me with the expression of someone who was thinking about permanent arrangements rather than casual dating. After he left, Claire and I sat on the porch swing while Brad got the children ready for bed, enjoying the comfortable spring evening and the sense of resolution that had settled between us. "Mom," she said as we watched fireflies begin to flicker in the growing dusk, "I want you to know that I'm proud of you, not just for finding someone wonderful, but for never giving up on the idea that you deserved happiness." "Thank you, sweetheart," I said, leaning against her shoulder the way I used to when she was young and we would sit together on this same swing. "That means more to me than you know." "Do you think you'll marry him?" she asked with the curiosity of someone who was beginning to imagine new family configurations. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I know that whatever happens, I'm not the same woman who was humiliated by cruel strangers on the internet. I'm someone who took a risk, weathered the consequences, learned from the experience, and found love anyway." "And if those people could see you now?" she asked. I thought about the question seriously, imagining the women who had called me desperate and the men who had made crude jokes about older women seeking companionship. I thought about their shock if they could see me now, in a loving relationship with someone whose success and character were unquestionable, whose attention and affection for me were obvious to anyone who cared to note. If they could see me now, I said finally, I hope they would understand that love doesn't have an expiration date, that desire and hope and the capacity for joy don't disappear at 60 or 70 or any age. I hope they would realize that the woman they mocked was worthy of exactly the kind of love she was seeking. Claire squeezed my hand. I think they would be amazed, she said, and probably jealous, as we sat together in the gathering darkness, listening to the sounds of my family settling in for the night, and thinking about the man who had brought such unexpected joy into my life. I realized that the best revenge against those who had tried to diminish me was not their embarrassment or their apologies, but my own happiness. I had proven that a woman my age could attract not just any partner, but an extraordinary one, not through desperation or compromise, but through the simple act of being authentically myself. The story that had begun with public humiliation had become one of triumph, not because I had won some competition against those who had mocked me, but because I had refused to let their cruelty define my possibility. I was 62 years old, deeply in love, and just beginning the next chapter of my life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.